They made him stand in the public hall while the crowd whispered behind metal masks. The Empire called it restoration marriage, but everyone knew what it truly was, a punishment. He was being forced to marry a shunned alien woman the world had already decided was unworthy. She stood beside him in silence. Her skin shimmered faintly with traces of bioluminescence, dimmed by years of neglect. Officials called her defective. Traders called her worthless. Even the word slave followed her like a shadow. She didn't meet his eyes, not out of defiance, but because she had learned that eye contact often led to pain. He had expected anger. Or resentment. Maybe even hatred. But instead, he felt only confusion. Their first days together passed in uneasy quiet. She cooked carefully, cleaned without being asked, and slept on the floor even when offered a bed. When he told her she didn't have to, she simply said, "I was never allowed to choose before." That sentence lingered in his mind. He began to notice the small things, the way she memorized his habits, the way she startled at sudden noise, and how her eyes softened when he thanked her. One night, during a citywide blackout, she panicked. Darkness, for her, had always meant punishment. He sat beside her, speaking softly until her breathing steadied. And for the first time, she looked at him without fear. "No one has ever stayed," she whispered. Something shifted between them that night. He began teaching her to read the trade language. She taught him the star songs of her people, melodies nearly erased by captivity. They laughed, at first quietly, then freely. What began as a sentence slowly became a choice. When the Empire finally offered to annul the marriage, he refused. Because the woman they had forced upon him was no longer a mark of disgrace. She was his partner. His home. And the love he never expected to find among the stars. Refusing the annulment wasn't the end. It was the beginning of trouble. Word spread quickly through the lower districts. A human had chosen to keep a shunned alien slave as his wife. Some mocked him. Others warned him. But the Empire watched with a colder kind of interest. Love was unpredictable, and obedience was easier to control. She sensed the danger before he did. "Choosing me brings risk," she said one evening, her voice calm but edged with truth. "My kind was meant to disappear quietly." He shook his head. "Not anymore." Together, they removed the identification collar the Empire had forced upon her, a band that had once defined her entire existence. The process was dangerous. Alarms blared, patrols passed too close. But when the collar finally hit the floor, she stared at it as if it were something haunted. "I don't know who I am without this," she whispered. "Then we'll find out together," he said. He began the impossible task of registering her as a free citizen. The system resisted him at every turn, forms lost, names erased, threats disguised as polite warnings. But each night, she grew stronger, standing taller, speaking more, reclaiming pieces of herself the Empire had tried to erase. Then, one afternoon, she sang. In the crowded marketplace, her voice rose, clear and haunting, a song of her people, long forbidden. The melody drifted through the metal streets and stilled every voice. Some felt unease. Others felt something rarer, regret. That was when the Empire acted. Summons. Interrogations. A final ultimatum. Give her back, or lose everything. That night, she packed her few belongings in silence. "I won't be the reason you fall," she said, setting the bag by the door. He caught her hand. "I was already falling," he said softly. "Just not down." For the first time, she wept, not from fear, but from being chosen. When dawn came, they left the city behind, walking toward the outer colonies where the Empire's grip weakened and freedom had room to breathe. Behind them, the Empire lost a slave. Ahead of them, two lives, broken in different ways, began to align. And across the stars, the Empire would soon learn, love, once awakened, is the hardest force in the galaxy to control, the outer colonies were nothing like the Empire's shining cities. Rusted docks drifted in vacuum, held together by borrowed power and stubborn hope. Laws here were thin, enforced only by distance and distrust. For the first time in her life, she was not instantly recognized as property. But freedom, they soon learned, came with its own dangers. They took work where they could. He repaired navigation cores, she assisted traders, her sharp memory and quiet focus quickly earning their respect. Still, some stared too long at the faint bioluminescent marks on her skin. Some asked questions that were safer unanswered. One night, bounty scanners swept the sector. The Empire had labeled her as misplaced assets. They hid in the lower decks of a cargo ring while patrol ships glided overhead. In the darkness, she trembled, not from fear of punishment, but from fear of losing what she had found. "If they take me," she whispered, "don't fight. Survive." He took her hand. "We survived together." The next day, an old alien woman found them, one of the free kin, a hidden network of escaped slaves and quiet sympathizers. She recognized the faint patterns of starsong markings on the woman's skin. "You carry a lost lineage," she said softly. "Your people were not weak. You were silenced." That night, surrounded by strangers who somehow felt like kin, she listened to stories of her ancestors, scientists, navigators, singers of living maps. Slavery had not erased them. It had only buried their light. And something inside her reignited. She began to speak with confidence, to question, to lead. He watched her transformation not with fear, but with pride. Loving her no longer meant sheltering something fragile, it meant standing beside something powerful. But the Empire never forgot its debts. A final message arrived at the colony: return the asset voluntarily, and the human will be spared. She read it once, then deleted it. "They think I belong to them," she said. "But I belong here." When she looked at him, it was no longer as someone waiting to be chosen. She was choosing too. And deep within the heart of the Empire, a decision was made. Not to reclaim a slave, but to silence a symbol. Their quiet life was ending. And their courage was about to be tested by fire. The attack did not come with fire or explosions. It came with order. Imperial envoys arrived at the outer colony under the banner of diplomacy, clean ships, calm voices, and legal language sharp enough to cut lives apart. They didn't make arrests. They simply reclassified the colony as a restricted zone and froze all movement. No ships in. No ships out. Panic spread quietly. The free kin understood immediately. This wasn't about resources or territory. It was about her. About what she represented, a former slave living freely, choosing love, reminding others of what they'd lost. That night, she stood before the gathered community, hands steady, voice unwavering. "They won't stop if I hide," she said. "They'll only learn to hunt better." Fear rose in him, sharp and instinctive. "You don't owe anyone a sacrifice," he said. She turned to him, her eyes glowing faintly in the low light. "I owe myself a future," she replied. "And so do they." The plan was simple, but dangerous. She would come forward not as property, not as a fugitive, but as a witness. She would broadcast her story, her people's history, and proof of the Empire's crimes across open channels before they could silence her. If they tried to take her, the galaxy would be watching. On the day of the broadcast, Imperial officers surrounded the central tower. Drones hovered overhead. The air itself felt heavy, waiting. She took his hands one last time. "I was taught that love was weakness," she said softly. "But loving you taught me courage." He wanted to tell her not to go. To beg her to stay. Instead, he nodded, because love, he'd learned, was not possession. It was respect. The signal went live. Her voice carried across colonies, relays, and worlds, calm, unbroken, undeniable. "Names. Records. Songs once forbidden. Truth woven into memory. The empire cut the feed. But it was too late. Messages began to pour in, support, outrage, calls for justice. The silence the empire depended on was beginning to break. As officers closed in, the free kin stepped forward, not with weapons, but with presence. And for the first time, the empire hesitated. Because this was no longer a man protecting a slave. This was a galaxy beginning to remember. And love, once quiet, once private, had become an act of defiance that no power could ever undo. The empire never admitted defeat. They called it a strategic withdrawal, blamed rogue officials, and erased names from the records. But across the colonies, something irreversible had begun. Hearings opened. Trade routes protested. And one by one, former slaves stepped out of the shadows, no longer hiding, no longer silent. The symbol they feared had escaped their control. She was moved off-world under protection, not as cargo, but as a civilian witness. For the first time, the transport logs recorded her name, not a number. He walked beside her through the docking bay, aware that every step they took together had once been forbidden. Life was not perfect. There were still threats. Quiet surveillance. Long nights when fear returned like an old scar. But there was also laughter. Work chosen freely. Music sung without permission. One evening, on a small frontier world beyond the Empire's reach, they stood beneath an open sky, no domes, no barriers, just stars, endless and honest. "I used to think love was something for the powerful," she said softly. "Something people like me were never meant to survive with." He smiled. "I thought love was something that happened to other people." She took his hand, not with hesitation, not out of habit, but as a choice made in freedom. Together, they built a quiet life. She mapped new trade routes using her people's rediscovered star songs. He repaired ships that carried others toward their own beginnings. Sometimes refugees arrived seeking safety. Sometimes hope arrived disguised as fear. Years later, the Empire would still whisper her name with discomfort. Because she was proof. Proof that a slave could become a voice. That a forced union could become a partnership. That love, once dismissed as weakness, could outlast control, law, and fear. They were never famous. They were something stronger. They were free.